Good evening and welcome to another edition of Newsmaker Live with me, Kendall Burton. I have two special guests with me this evening in the persons of Mr. Trevor Louisi, the Managing Director of the St. Lucia Electricity Services Limited, Lucelec, and Mr. David Jankowski, a regulatory consultant, and his designation gives away the topic for tonight. We'll be talking about regulation. It's been a subject that's been in the news, in the air for a while. So we want to spend some time talking about it today and demystify some of the information that's been bandied around. Gentlemen, welcome to Newsmaker Live. Mr. Jankowski, welcome to St. Lucia.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Pleasure to be here.
Is it your first time, Mr. Louisi, on Newsmaker Live?
Yes, I think it's the first time on Newsmaker Live. I've been on other programs, but perhaps the first time on Newsmaker Live.
Yeah, well, hopefully not your last. And as this regulation issue progresses, hopefully you can come back again. Traditionally, utilities have been vertically integrated monopolies in the developed countries like the US, where you're from, Mr. Jankowski. The technology has developed to such a point where competition is an option. So I wanted to speak to that for me, first of all, and tell me how realistic is it for us to think that the same can be applied to a small economy or developing country like St. Lucia?
Well, I think that's frankly an excellent question, because even in the United States, the issue of competition in generation, not necessarily in transmission and distribution, but in generation only, has been a matter of debate since the late 1990s. Those of us who have been around for a while saw some successes in some states, and we saw some problems. California had some significant problems in 2000. In a small island economy such as here in St. Lucia, yes, I think competition could be possible, but the conditions have to be right, and I think the transition would have to be managed very carefully.
Mr. Louisi, the conditions have to be right. Are the conditions right?
I'm not too sure what he means by the conditions, but we have said to the government that we're not fundamentally opposed to the opening up of the generation side of the business, particularly in the area of renewable energy. And I think that there seems to be some consensus on the position between the government and ourselves. We simply think that the market is too small for there to be a sort of general opening up of the entire industry. As we've heard that on the transmission and distribution side, it's virtually not a wise thing to consider, where perhaps you may have one utility running poles and lines on one side of the street and another one on the other side of the street. I think that would just lead to additional chaos. But I think
was serious consideration ever being given to that at all?
I don't think so. But you would be surprised that I think in our sister country Dominica, that some of that is actually being considered to open up aspects of the transmission and perhaps distribution side of the business. So we hoping that common sense will prevail across there, and perhaps that would not happen.
But one of the drivers of moves to regulate here in the Caribbean has been what's been happening in the developed countries. One of the reasons that's been put forward is the liberalization or the opening up of the telecommunications sector. But obviously, well, for me at least, from a layman's perspective, it's like comparing apples to oranges. You obviously both have been more involved in energy generation. So what are the differences? What can be brought across and shared, and what is feasible and what isn't feasible?
Well, first, I'd hasten to point out that regulation is not simply needed because there's the possibility of competition. Indeed, if there were pure competition, regulation would not be needed almost at all, and that's what we've seen over the past 20 years with the explosion of the mobile industry and with technological advancements. We basically saw the old vertically integrated cable and wireless days, and a regulator would regulate cable and wireless the same way they would regulate a water company. Now with the technological advancements in some countries, you have 4, 5, or 6 mobile carriers, and I know of countries that have essentially gotten out of the business of rate regulation because or regulating tariffs or prices, because just like with groceries, if you don't like one supplier, you can just go down the store to get another one. So regulation can isn't necessarily tied to the introduction of additional generation sources or to competition.
Yeah. Now, you both mentioned the fact that the transmission and distribution side of things will most likely remain a monopoly for obvious reasons, which you pointed out. But if we are to introduce competition or alternative energy sources, obviously it's going to have implications for your transmission and distribution. What are some of the concerns that Lucille has?
We've highlighted a number of these concerns, and now you're going to have a system where other producers of electricity are going to now interconnect into that system, so that the power that is being generated from these new entities can be used to supplement whatever it is that we are producing, to then provide the end suppliers. So there are issues such as grid control. Who's going to control the grid? Meaning, who's going to speak to which supplier and tell that supplier how much capacity they need to bring onto the system at any specific point in time. So that's one of the major issues that we've raised. The other issue relates to stability of the grid. If you don't manage how these new sources are integrated onto the grid, it can lead to what we refer to as stability issues. So these are two areas that we've highlighted that there needs to be some serious consideration, because as it is now, Luselect has that responsibility. And we are not too clear at this point in time what the new regulation will propose in terms of who takes over that responsibility. And believe me, it's a significant responsibility.
Yeah. But you also have concerns about the regulatory body, how it is going to be composed, how it's going to be structured, its mandate. What are some of those concerns that you have?
First and foremost, we're not opposed to regulation. We think that based on the experiences that we've seen in some of the other countries, that the process has to be carefully thought through. You need to make sure that the commission is staffed with very competent people, so that they understand the industry, they understand the business, they understand what the objectives of general regulation is. You also need to make sure that there's a certain level of independence, that you don't want, say for instance, the utility being able to control what happens at any of these hearings, or the government on the other hand having a sort of overpowering influence and telling the commission that I want the rates reduced by a certain percentage. So there's a process that has to go through, and we are trying to make sure that whenever we get the opportunity to sit around the table with the government as they develop the new regulations, that we try to bring these issues into the discussion, so that at the end of the day you get a structure or a system that is fairly well grounded, And at the end of the day, all of the stakeholders have the confidence in that body, that whatever decisions that it arrives at the end of the day are transparent as well. So these are some of the things that we've been discussing with the government.
Yeah. You want to add anything to that, Mr. Jankowski?
Well, I agree basically wholeheartedly with what the director has said. The importance of an independent regulator can't be overstated. There are various degrees of independence around the world, and I think from what I understand from my time here on the island, that there's been a working group and good interaction between Lusalek and the government in trying to nail down some of these points, but without repeating them, an independent board, perhaps qualifications for the board. What are the term members for the board? Are they staggered so they're not necessarily tied to any particular government? Qualifications of staff. How will the regulator be funded to ensure that it has a reasonable degree of independence? All of those are legitimate concerns, and it sounds like they're being worked through in a pretty systematic manner.
Yeah. Are you satisfied they are being worked through in a systematic manner? Because I know Carilec at that level has always insisted from the time you start talking about regulation that the utilities have to be involved in the discussion. Yeah.
I would say to a significant extent, yes. I think as with any process or any discussion, not all of your recommendations would be taken on board. In our case, when the initial draft was presented to us, we saw a number of issues in there or items included in the document that we didn't have a fundamental problem with. We felt that they were well thought through. There were a couple others that we suggested perhaps could be changed. We referred them to some of the legislative documents in some of the other territories, so they were able to go back and reference some of the issues in there. There's still one or two that we trying to convince the government that perhaps they should take a slightly different view on the matter, but we've not been too successful as yet. And one of them in particular relates to some of the authority that the minister will have, and we think that if he shifts that responsibility elsewhere, it will give the process a greater or better appearance of independence and limited government involvement.
Yeah, so you're saying the minister shouldn't be involved at all?
I'm not saying that the minister should not be involved at all, but without going into too much of the specifics, I think that there's some issues in the draft legislation that gives the minister some authority that we think, in our opinion, should be elsewhere.
Yeah. Now, you've, Mr. Jankowski, had some experience in the Caribbean as well. There are a number of islands and territories who have already introduced regulators. Barbados, Belize, the Cayman Islands, Dominica, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago. Are we moving into this with the benefit of their own experience? Do you feel some degree of comfort that has been tried here, or is it a case where one size doesn't fit all?
One size certainly doesn't fit all.
Yeah.
But like I said earlier, in the draft documents that have been presented, and even with the comments that we have provided, we have researched, and the drafters have researched a number of these documents around the region, and it's essentially trying to make sure that some of the problems that have occurred in some of these islands will hopefully not occur in our situation. So we are trying to take some of the best practices from these various documents and bring them together in a cohesive manner for our purposes. And when I say our purposes, in St. Lucia. And like I said, there were some issues that we had, and we referred them to specific sections. Say, for instance, in the Belize legislation, and the drafters were able to go back and look at it and make amendments to ensure that the document that they were producing was further enhanced.
Now, before the show, we were talking about the importance and the need for information and accurate information about regulation. I know once the topic of regulation first came up, and you listen to some of the talk shows and the calls coming in, one got the impression that people thought or still think that regulation means, you know, government clamping down on Lucille and reduce rates for the consumer and that sort of thing. You know, what are some of the myths about regulation that I want to give you the opportunity here to dispel tonight that you've come across?
I think one of the things that we hear a lot is that Lucille is not regulated, and that's the furthest thing from the truth. There's the Electricity Supply Act, which was first developed in 1964, and it's been amended over the years, but it is the document that guides how we conduct our business. And half of it refers to the technical aspects of our business, and the other half of it refers to the financial aspects of our business. So for the financial aspects, we obligated to provide the Minister of Finance, in this case, a number of reports in terms of our performance. And on the technical side, we are required to provide the minister with responsibility for infrastructure. That's now being transitioned to the Ministry of Energy, or all the technical matters. So it's a document that lays out the law that guides our operations. Some of the other things about regulation is we think that if it is managed, the whole process is managed properly, it can redound to the benefit of all the stakeholders. And when I say all the stakeholders, I mean the customers, the utility, and the government, who generally sets, policy directives for the country.
Okay, we're due for a break. Let's take the break. When we come back, we can talk a little bit more about what the advantages of regulation are for those stakeholders that you mentioned. This is Newsmaker Live. We'll be right back.